pandemic. Yes, the pandemic is still here, but I am just celebrating seeing you on International Women's Day, where we are all pandemic survivors. And so I'm so glad that Tim Chris had the wisdom to determine that we needed not only to host this evening's wonderful presentation, but we had to do it hybrid. We had to have an opportunity for us to come together in person, to see eye to eye, to make sure we know that not only is history important, but we today are important. And so without further ado, I would like to introduce my partner, our partner, NJPAC's partner, Tim Chris.
Thanks, Aisha. I want to add my welcome on behalf of the Newark History Society to everyone here and to those joining us on Zoom. We had some 80 people sign up to join us virtually, but it is so good to see people in person here, because this is the first time we've met in person in 2 years. Since the middle of March 2020. We have put on 9 virtual programs since then, but tonight is our first attempt at a hybrid program, both live in person and via Zoom, and I guess Facebook Live for the library as well. So this will be a bit of an experiment. We will learn how to do this even better next time. But this is one of the good things that came out of the pandemic, is that we learned how to do programs in a hybrid manner, both live and virtually. And figuring that out is due to Diego Quintero of the library. And I just want to thank Diego for figuring all this out. I'm grateful to NJPAC for co-sponsoring this with the library and the Newark History Society. And I'm also grateful to the members of the Newark History Society for hanging in there through the pandemic. We actually increased our membership last year, despite all odds. And I think everybody here is probably a member, but if you're watching this and you have not yet renewed your membership, it's $25, and you can go to newarkhistorysociety.org and join us for this year. There will be a Q&A session after this. There will be questions in person here. I will be monitoring the chat or the Q&A and relaying those questions as well. So as you listen to George's presentation, type your questions in and we'll get to them at the end of the program. With that, I want to ask Dale Colston to introduce our speaker. I think most of you know Dale as the librarian in charge of this wonderful James Brown African American room here at the Newark Public Library. Dale?
Thank you, Tim. Thank you. Yeah, my name is Dale Colston. I'm a supervising librarian here in the James Brown African American Room, and I too am a member of the Newark History Society. So perhaps the entire room. Our space, the James Brown African American Room, was named in honor of the late James Library Brown, a librarian, poet, activist, and influencer who was instrumental in making sure that the library seek and maintain books and resources and present programs examining and celebrating the African American experience. Mr. Brown was especially committed to urging Newark youth to pursue education and to understand the importance of the library's role in their academic growth. And we want to thank everyone who's here today and everyone who's joining us virtually for their continued support of the work we do here at the James Brown African American Room. It is now my privilege to introduce George Robb for tonight's program. George is a resident of Newark, a wonderful friend of the library, and a trustee of the Newark History Society. He is also a highly rated professor of history at William Paterson University. In recent years, he has done extensive research into the vital role women played in business during the late 19th and both in Europe and America. His latest book is Ladies of the Ticker, Women in Wall Street from the Gilded Age to the Great Depression, published by the University of Illinois Press. We're fortunate that he's turned his focus to the history of Newark. And we look forward this evening to learning a great deal more about African-American businesswomen in the early 20th century.
One of our in-person meetings that we have in the future, we'll have more and more people coming in person because it's nice, as Aisha was saying, it's nice to have fellowship with people in person. So breaking barriers, this is really breaking barriers too. I'll be more clear about what I mean by that. Doesn't seem to be advancing. Okay, there we go. All right, so in the early 20th century, a growing number of African-American women in Newark broke economic and cultural barriers by establishing and operating a wide variety of businesses. Pioneering entrepreneurs had to overcome both sexist assumptions about a woman's place as being in the home and racist policies that sought to limit African-American employment to unskilled, low-wage occupations. Not seeming to advance. I'm sorry about that. Sure. Yeah, Diego, is that there? Do I need to just ask you to advance it for me? Sorry about this, Will. Bear with us. It was working fine a minute ago. Yeah. All right. The genesis of this research was a book I published several years ago about the history of women in Wall Street. And this got me thinking about Newark women who might have been involved in business, banking, and finance. So this is Breaking Barriers 1. This is a talk I gave 8 years ago in 2014 to the Newark History Society about pioneering business women in Newark in the early 20th century, especially women who worked in Newark's important insurance industry. Now, all of the women I discussed in this earlier presentation, yeah. Hideo, can you bring it back? Maybe we're going to reboot. All right, so all of the women that I looked at in this earlier presentation were white women. I tried hard to find information about Black women in the insurance industry in Newark, and at that time I was unable to. Since then, I've uncovered a lot of interesting information about Black women entrepreneurs in Newark during the first quarter of the 20th century. And so that's really what I'm going to be focusing on tonight, is the period 1900 to 1925. This era was a key moment in both the history of Newark and its African-American community. Newark's economy was at its peak in the early 20th century, and the Black community experienced a new growth and dynamism, more than doubling in size with the great migration of African-Americans up from the South. So tonight, what I want to discuss are the various employment opportunities available to Black women in Newark a century ago, but also to discuss the challenges of researching this topic, the kinds of evidence that's available, and the limitations of certain types of historical documents. I also want to point out areas where I think there is potential for new work. So in 1987, Deborah Gray White published an article in the Journal of American History entitled "Mining the Forgotten: Manuscript Sources for Black Women's History." She pointed out that until recently, the world of Black women was, quote, peripheral to those most likely to keep records of any kind. Government agencies, universities, libraries, archives, and historical societies didn't bother to collect and preserve information about the activities and accomplishments of Black women. Now, obviously that's changed a lot, thank God. But let's start with the basic source of information about Black women's employment in Newark, the US Census. Next one. All right, thanks. So the 1900 census shows us that Black women in Newark work at far higher rates than white women. 45% of Black women work for wages in Newark, compared to 24.8% for native-born white women. If you look at white women immigrants, they worked at slightly higher rates than native-born white women, but at much lower rates than African-American women. While overall 45% of Black women in Newark worked for wages, the figure was even higher for young Black women. You can see that more than 60% of Black women between 16 and 20 worked for wages in Newark. So the percentages of women, Black and white, who worked for wages declined over the course of a woman's life cycle. As women married and had children, they began leaving the job market. And you can see this is much more pronounced for white women than it is for Black women, though. For Black women, this was much less so. Black men's wages were so low that they were less able to keep their wives at home. The male breadwinner wage was the ideal a century ago for most men, Black and white. And Black men advocated for higher wages so that their wives and children wouldn't have to work. And while Black women certainly supported higher wages, better jobs for Black men, they also wanted better opportunities, employment opportunities for themselves. Next slide. Here, the 1900 census shows us some of the jobs most frequently performed by white women in Newark. This represents a wide variety of employment opportunities. These are just some of the 5 top categories for white women in Newark who are working for wages, and it only constitutes about 41% of the jobs that were available for white women. So it's, and note that only about 9% of white women who worked as servants. Next. And that's quite dramatic when you set it against the figures from the 1900 census for Black women. The census only lists 2 occupations for Black women, servants and laundress. And those are the lowest paid and lowest status jobs available. The census does not bother to enumerate any other occupations that could be classed under other. Right? That is a category we're going to explore further tonight. But first, let me express some reservations about the census. Historically, the census has undercounted minority populations, and there are many reasons for believing that it has not provided a very accurate picture of Black women's employment. It leaves out a lot. Next slide. So these are just some of the broad categories that I think are left out of the census, and I'll talk about them in turn very briefly. But there's a vast array of economic opportunities that lay outside the formal system of full-time wage labor. And Black women were especially drawn to these categories due to the double bind of racist and sexist economic barriers they face. So let's look at some of this work that does not get listed in the census. Next. Right. So uncredited work in family businesses is a big category. Family businesses were usually listed in a man's name, and women's contributions were not credited. Funeral businesses are a classic example. Those are almost always family businesses. This is an interesting ad I found serendipitously in the Newark papers by Henry Brown, who ran a funeral business in Newark. There's a lot going on in this ad. I don't have time to talk about. We're hoping in the future to do a program on African-American funeral businesses in Newark, the history of them. But Henry Brown's wife, Kathleen, worked in this business with him, but that's not, in the census, she's not listed as having employment. And so that's typical. Mr. Churchman, James Churchman, who had a funeral business, which still operates in Newark to this day, his wife, Minnie Churchman, worked in this business with him, but that's not credited in the census. She inherited that business and ran it after he died. But again, that doesn't appear in the census. Next slide. This whole question of part-time jobs, or women who worked multiple jobs, and these jobs that I have listed here might be engaged in full-time, but many women listed on the census with no occupation, or who are described, Black women who are described as homemakers. Some of them earned extra money by teaching piano part-time, or by taking in sewing. Okay. Next. All right, this is one of my favorite Newarkers, Blanche Harris, the hardest working woman in Newark. I call her really probably the hardest working person in Newark. Until a couple of years ago, she was completely forgotten. She's a very important figure in African-American communities. She appears in no histories of Newark, including histories that focus on the African-American community. She was actually discovered by the librarian Beth Sack Cohen here at the Newark Public Library a few years ago, when Beth and Noelle, Lorraine Williams, and myself were working on an exhibit on the women's suffrage movement in Newark. Beth found a story about her in a newspaper account. And since then, Noelle and Beth and myself have uncovered a lot more information about Blanche Harris. So talk about side hustles, as people talk about today. These are just some of the paid occupations Blanche Harris engaged in between 1900 and 1930. Now, she wasn't doing all of these jobs at one time, but at any given moment, she was engaged in several of them. And if you look at the census, the 1900 census lists no occupations for her. In the 1910 census, she's listed as a homemaker. I think the 1920 census lists her as an elocution teacher, which you can see is one of the things she did, but at that time she's doing all these other work. And so the census just isn't, it's not set up to deal with people who are doing multiple kinds of jobs, and that just gets left out. Okay. Next slide. So the informal economy refers to the many ways of making money outside formal wage labor. The historian Robert L. Boyd coined the term survivalist entrepreneur to describe Black people who became self-employed in response to a desperate need to find an independent means of livelihood. Survivalist entrepreneurs. It's an interesting term. There is a long tradition going back to slavery times of Black women selling goods, often food, at street markets or door to door. Because of the fact that so many Black women worked outside the home, childcare was a serious problem. So this is another way in which some Black women could make money part-time. Those who were at home, perhaps because they had young children, they could look after other women's children who were at work. And during a time when a lot of people were moving up from the South, not everyone had support networks in Newark. Not everyone had family members who could help look after their children. Many Black women in Newark rented rooms to help make ends meet. And I suspect in this period, in the early 20th century, maybe a majority of Black women in Newark rented out rooms. Many Black people in Newark could, or Black people in Newark could usually find work during this period, but finding a place to live was not so easy. Many landlords wouldn't rent to Black people. Serious housing discrimination existed in most neighborhoods. In the early 20th century, Black Newarkers were crowded into central downtown wards, the old 2nd, 3rd, and 4th wards, and streets in the Ironbound district near the Pennsylvania Railroad tracks. A one-family home might accommodate 2 or 3 Black families or be bursting at the seams with boarders. Next. Georgia Queen, she's a very interesting Newarker. I'm going to talk about her in a little bit later in another context. But she is a widow, and she's listed in the 1900 census as a domestic, but she clearly was also a boarding housekeeper, right? Her husband had died recently, and she and her young daughter were basically renting out rooms to 11 different boarders, mostly single men who'd moved up from the South. And yet that's, That's not listed in the census. So there are, because of this, because of the housing crunch and because of the difficulty of Black people finding places to live, there are lots and lots of women in Newark who were essentially boarding housekeepers, but that they're not credited for doing that. Okay, next. All right, so here is an array of jobs that weren't recorded in the census because they were illegal. Next, I'll talk about some of these, but this is a very recent, excellent book about the underground economy in New York City that argues that some Black women embraced this work, underground work, illegal work, because it provided labor autonomy and opportunities for success in an otherwise restricted marketplace. There's a lot of room for research on the underground economy in Newark. Whit Strube recently discussed the business of prostitution and pornography in Newark. It's difficult to find information about this work because, of course, it was illegal and people weren't, it certainly was something that was not reported on the census, but there is some information we can find on this. Next. So here's a Black woman in Newark arrested for running a disorderly house, which was a common euphemism from the time for brothel. It's harder to find information about this because a lot of these disorderly houses would spring up. And so Ms. Taylor was probably after hours, she probably was running a boarding house, but after hours, she probably welcomed men into her house and served them alcohol, right, without a license. So that was illegal. And they probably were playing cards and playing dice. So there's gambling, that was illegal. And then she probably allowed women who were working as prostitutes to circulate among her guests, and they could go back to, if they wanted to take a break, go back to a bedroom, and then those women would give her some of the cut. So it might not be officially a brothel if the women, the prostitutes aren't actually living there, but these kinds of, I think it would be possible to map disorderly houses in Newark based on arrest records and stories about this in the newspaper. Okay. But as I say, it's difficult to find information about this. So this has been a very quick survey of some of the work available to Black women in Newark, apart from being a servant or a laundress, which are the only, as I said, the only two categories listed in the census. But since the census mostly overlooks this work, where can we find out about the other kinds of work? Where can we find out information about the other kinds of work that Black women were doing in Newark? All right, the Newark City Directory was published annually. It's very useful for cross-checking against the census, and it lists business categories. But finding Black people in the city directory isn't easy. So because of the listing categories, that's nice because you can look up something like dressmakers and you'll find several pages with hundreds of women listed as dressmakers. But then it's like, well, some of those women are Black women, but which ones? And I used to have confidence I could find them because some of the old city directories would put a C next to Black people for colored, as a kind of legacy of racism. It's great for historians, right, to be able to, but then I found that that was not done with any kind of consistency. So one person 1 year might have a C next to their name, the very next year it might not. So how this got applied, I have no idea the mechanism by which this happened, but you can't really count on it. So what you would ultimately have to do is look up all those hundreds of names in the census to see for racial categorizations, which is very, very time consuming. It might be worth it in some cases, but there are other sources, of course, as well that we can consult. And this, of course, is a fantastic one, which is a directory of Negro business interests in Essex County. And most of the people listed in here, because of Newark being the largest city, are Black people who had businesses in Newark. Unfortunately, it did not become a regular publication. It's kind of a one-off. So, but it's a great source to cross reference against the census and against the regular city directories. This is a 1921 publication celebrating the 50th anniversary of Bethany Baptist Church, one of Newark's oldest Black churches. Amarillo Kelly, one of the members of the church, put it together. And not only does it tell the early history of the church, but there's a lot of biographical information about members of the church, including Black men and women who ran businesses, and often includes photographs, which is fantastic because it's very, very hard to find photographs of Black people from Newark in this earlier period. This is also a very wonderful source, William Ashby's 1972 Reflections. It was an unpublished lecture about the African-American community in Newark about a century ago. Ashby was a pioneering civil rights activist. He was the first director of the Urban League in Newark. He became a director of the Urban League in 1917, and all these years later, he was living in Newark. And so he focuses on this period, 1910 to 1916. He says this is a period right before the African-American population really explodes with the Great Migration. So it's sort of a snapshot in time. And he talks about where Black people lived in Newark and the kinds of jobs they did and the churches they went to. And he mentioned some prominent Black people in the community, including men and women in business. So this becomes yet another source for me to draw on. So after mining these different sources, as much as I could, what do I think were the principal other occupations and businesses Black women worked apart from servant and laundress in the early 20th century? All right, so I think these are some of the principal occupations. Since I'm concentrating on independent businesswomen tonight, I'm not going to focus on women wage laborers. I won't be talking about, say, factory workers or waitresses tonight. That's certainly an interesting topic. These are the principal types of businesses which Black women in Newark owned and operated between like 1900 and 1925. These businesses cluster in certain broad categories, especially food and hospitality and fashion. Now, in part, this is work traditionally gendered as feminine, cooking and sewing, for example, or these are businesses that catered to women, like hairdressing. But there are other considerations, but another consideration I think is segregation. Many of these businesses provided goods and services to Black Newarkers that white businesses were unwilling or uninterested in providing. So I need to say something about how segregation operated in a northern city like Newark, how it differed from segregation in the South, and how this affected some of the kinds of business choices that people made. Jim Crow refers to a whole series of laws and practices that disenfranchised Black people and segregated society in the decades following the Civil War. Jim Crow was strongest in the American South, where the vast majority of Black people still lived. But this began to change in the early 20th century with the Great Migration of African Americans up from the rural South to northern cities like Newark. So hundreds of thousands of people are moving in the decades of the early 20th century. Now in the South, segregation was obvious and it was everywhere. Whites only signs were ubiquitous and separate and unequal facilities were the rule. Now in Newark, like other northern towns, there was little public segregation in the early 20th century. So for example, Blacks and whites could ride together on trains, streetcars, and buses. There weren't separate entrances or waiting rooms or bathrooms or water fountains for Black people and white people at Newark's train stations or municipal buildings or public libraries. Newark schools weren't segregated in the early 20th century. One notable exception was Newark's public swimming pools, where Black people could only use them one day a week. Black people could vote in New Jersey, and they did vote, and they could organize politically and socially in ways that were not possible in the South. But, right, there's going to be a but, right? Segregation certainly existed in Newark in the early 20th century. And as I pointed out earlier, many landlords wouldn't rent to Black people. Private businesses and organizations often excluded Black people. So when talking about segregation in the North, African Americans often called it James Crow, right? It's like, it was not as obvious or as brutal as in the South, but it was there all the same. It was, James Crow was Jim Crow's more sophisticated brother, okay? So some trade unions in Newark, for example, the hod carriers and the carpenters admitted Black members. Other unions, like the steamfitters and the electricians, wouldn't accept Black members. Some Newark theaters, like Miners Theater, refused Black patrons. Others, like Proctor's, sold them tickets but made them sit in the balcony. So there are these different ways in which it operated that were a little bit more complicated than in the South. The Dreamland amusement park admitted Black people, but it charged them twice as much as it charged white people. Which brings us to restaurants, highly segregated in Newark in the early 20th century. And these are some of the Black women who ran restaurants in Newark. And Black women didn't run restaurants in Newark just because cooking was seen as a thing that women did, but because most white restaurants wouldn't serve Black patrons. According to William Ashby, talking about this period in the early 20th century, only 3 white-owned restaurants in Newark would serve Blacks in the early 20th century. Waldorf's on Market Street, Grant's Lunch on Plain Street, and a Greek luncheonette on Market Street. Now, at this time, Newark had hundreds of restaurants. And many of these establishments, that is, many of these white restaurants, employed Black cooks and Black wait staff, but they wouldn't serve Black customers. And in this regard, Newark seems to have been worse than other nearby towns in New Jersey. For example, George Cannon, a Black dentist from Jersey City, who was an important civil rights leader, complained that when his business took him to Newark, he was refused service in one place after another. But this didn't happen to him in Jersey City, which is interesting, right? I mean, Newark and Jersey City were similar kinds of cities that were a half hour away on a streetcar. And yet, here's this one man saying in Jersey City, he didn't have any trouble as a Black man getting served in white restaurants. But in Newark, just was next to impossible. Why this was, I have no idea. It's an interesting question. It's an interesting topic to pursue, the kind of variations in segregation just within different communities in one part of the country, or even within a certain kind of community. Now, these particular women who are operating restaurants in Newark, I don't know much about them, and I probably won't ever be able to find much about them individually. Although Alethea Jefferson was the mother of Blanche Harris, who I showed earlier as the hardest working woman in Newark. And that was probably Blanche Harris's first job, working as a waitress in her mom's restaurant. William Ashby does remember Alethea Jefferson, and he describes her as, quote, a tall and robust woman who loudmouthed into everybody's business. So she sounds like an interesting character. Here are some more food-related businesses operated by Black women in Newark. Some of them supplied foods that recent transplants from the South craved, but were not available in most Newark shops: cornmeal, grits, black-eyed peas, okra. Miss Birdsong only sold chitlins, right? For those who like to dine low on the hog. I'd like to know more about the Daughters of Noah's Ark. Right? I suspect this was a cooperative grocery run by women from an African-American church, and the Mount Olivet Baptist Church on 8th Avenue was nearby, but that's just a guess on my part. I'd like to try to find out more about this if I can. Dressmakers and milliners were an important category of Black women's businesses. These women up here are just a sample of at least 15 African-American women with dress or hat shops in Newark in the late teens and the early 1920s. The Great Migration increased the Black population in Newark and led to the creation of new consumer markets for Black people. Even the lowest paid Black women in Newark had more spending money than their Southern counterparts. For example, in the early 20th century, Black domestics in Newark, Black women who were working as maids in Newark, earned between $4 and $6 per week, which is a very low wage at that time. But it was far better than the $2 per week for average that Black maids made in the South. Of course, the cost of living in Newark was higher, but it wasn't that much higher. So, even women working as maids in Newark had spending money that they didn't have before. They could buy nice clothes, and they could buy, there were, cheap luxuries that were not available to them before. So that provides an audience for some of these, or customers for some of these women dressmakers and hat makers. Jim Crow also created entrepreneurial opportunities for Black women who are often denied service by white businesses or treated as second-class service. For example, white clothing stores might sell goods to Black women, but they wouldn't let them try them on. They wouldn't let them try on hats. So if they wanted something, they take it, they could buy it, they could take it with them, they couldn't take it back, they couldn't bring it back if it didn't fit, they couldn't try it on. Clothes at department stores were probably cheaper than clothes at small dress shops like those operated by these women, but Black women in Newark patronized these Black-owned businesses because they offered their customers personal and respectful service. Hairdressers and beauty parlors. The biggest increase in Black women's businesses was in the category of hairdressing and beauty parlors. This is what economists call a protected market, referring to the refusal or disinterest of white business people to provide a service. And these examples, these particular women are just a few of the more than 40 Black women in Newark who operated hair care businesses in the early 1920s. This is by far the largest category of any Black-owned businesses in Newark, those by men or women. Among Black men in Newark, the most numerous businesses were barbershops. I found 31 barbershops owned by Black men in the early 1920s, compared to more than 40 beauty parlors owned by Black women. The second largest business for Black men were moving and storage businesses, in which there were about 20 in the early 1920s. The growth of African-American beauty businesses was facilitated by the professionalization in the manufacture and sale of Black hair care products and cosmetics. And the guiding light in this industry, the guiding lights in this industry were Madam C.J. Walker and Annie Turnbow Malone. They created factories to manufacture their products and beauty schools to teach their techniques. They also franchised beauty parlors around the country. Walker is usually credited as the first Black millionaire in America, and she's possibly the first woman millionaire in America who was self-made. That is, there were white women who were millionaires because they inherited this money from their family, but Walker's probably the first woman, period, in America to become a millionaire through, as I say, through her own exertions. Here's an example of one of Walker's franchises in Newark. The independent beauty parlor and school that was operated by Mrs. Imo Carter on Plain Street that taught C.J. Walker system, which is one that I believe employed hot combs. She did not invent that, but she came up with her own variation on that. By the 1920s, Walker's business empire was in decline, steadily eclipsed by another Black entrepreneur, New Jersey businesswoman Sarah Spencer Washington. Based in Atlantic City, the Apex News and Hair Company operated several factories and beauty schools, including one in Newark. So the Apex Beauty College in Newark was on West Kinney Street. She published magazines about fashion and beauty tips for Black women, and of course, this is the catalog of the cosmetics that her factories produced. You may remember a recent Newark history talk by Krista Clark about Lena Bronner, a Black woman from Newark who traveled to Africa in the 1930s, where she collected art, which she later donated to the Newark Museum and became an important part of the Newark Museum's African art collection. Bronner was an employee of the Apex Beauty School. And this is what facilitated, what made possible her trip to Africa, because there was an Apex Beauty School in Johannesburg in South Africa, right? So it's interesting about the beauty empires that Madam C.J. Walker and Sarah Spencer Washington created. They weren't just marketing around the United States, but they were marketing to Black women in the Caribbean or in Africa. They were international beauty empires. This 1930s ad from Newark's Simplex School of Beauty Culture emphasizes the economic independence afforded Black women by training as beauticians. In 1938, the US Department of Labor provided statistics on Black women's wages. That in 1938, the average Black woman who worked as a domestic earned between $5 and $6 a week. Black women who worked in factories earned about $10 a week. And Black women who worked in beauty shops earned between $8 and $15 a week. That is 2 to 3 times more than a domestic. So the $65 a week seems a bit inflated, though this may represent what a proprietor of a beauty shop made over a week. And she would have to, out of that $65, of course, pay her employees and rent and supplies and things like that. But the point is, the beauty industry was a very important way for a lot of Black women to make their way into the middle class and to become entrepreneurs. Newark. Okay, I'm going to finish by looking at the insurance industry in Newark and a few of the Black women who made a living by providing financial services to the Black community. Newark was a major insurance center in the United States, home to large corporations like Prudential and Mutual Benefit. In the early 20th century, these businesses employed thousands of Newarkers, including a growing number of women, a growing number of white women. They did not employ Black people of either sex, except as janitors or cleaning ladies. Most of Newark's leading life insurance companies also wouldn't sell policies to Black people, or else they treated Black customers unequally to white customers. As the Reverend C.H. Garlick of Newark's Bethany Baptist Church pointed out, quote, "The colored man is being defrauded by all insurance societies who do not pay him as much for the same money as they do the white man." That is, Black lives were literally valued less than white lives. Black people and white people would pay the exact same amount for a policy, but the payout to a white person upon their death would be higher. Not surprisingly, Black Newarkers once again created their own businesses to fill a void. These are the main Black-owned insurance businesses operating in Newark around 1920. This is, I think, a really fascinating topic. As far as I know, nobody has done work on this, but there's a lot of, I think, interesting potential here. Newark is this major insurance center, and people have done a lot of study on the history of the insurance companies in Newark, but there's this whole alternative Black-owned insurance sector in Newark that I don't think has been looked at all. Of course, it's going to be harder to find information about them, and I'm struggling to find that information, but I think there's some important potential for future research here. Now, these companies employed some Black women, mostly in clerical positions. I'm still looking for more details about that. As far as I've been able to tell, all the officers and managers of these Black insurance companies were Black men. Nonetheless, a few enterprising Black women created opportunities for themselves in Newark's financial sector, such as Anna E. Whittington, who worked as a real estate broker, an insurance agent, and a notary public. And I know notary public doesn't sound like a big deal, but in 1920, there were only 3 Black people in Newark who were notary publics, and she was one of them. I have not been able to find a photograph of Whittington, but this is an image of Upper Bank Street near her office. And Upper Bank Street was an important center of Black-owned businesses in Newark 100 years ago. It's completely been obliterated. There's no remnants of it nowadays, but where it once stood, where this Black business district once was, is now the campus of Essex County College. A few days ago, Beth Sack Cohen sent me an email, said, "Oh, she's found some interesting information about Anna Whittington." And I was like, "Oh, wow, great. I'm going to be talking about her in a couple of days." So Beth sent me this, and this was some additional information about Whittington that I didn't know. For example, in one of her business ads, she boasted that she was involved in, quote, "securing and selling homes for all the people. Why not for you?" She was on the executive committee of the North Jersey branch of the National Negro Business League. And when she died in 1956, her estate was worth more than $100,000, which was a lot of money back then. She did not have any children, so she left almost all of it to charity. Her largest bequest was to the United Negro College Fund, and she left a lot of money to the NAACP as well. Betty Lightfoot, luckily I was able to find a picture of her. She was a member of Bethany Baptist, and she's this photograph is from that early history of Bethany. She was also a real estate broker and an insurance agent, and she established the New Jersey Real Estate Investment Company in Newark. So this was a company she created and ran herself to help finance Black home ownership at a time when most banks wouldn't give Black people mortgages. So I know we think of real estate, being a real estate agent today, it's a very feminized business. This was not the case 100 years ago. So not only were these women pioneers in the real estate business, but for them, it was also a kind of civil rights activism, because helping Black people get homes and buy homes was, not just a business, but it was, pushing back against a kind of a segregated housing market that was really intense 100 years ago. All right, Georgia Queen, right? I mentioned her earlier as sort of running an unofficial boarding house. In 1900, she was struggling to support her family as a domestic and a boarding housekeeper. But by 1910, she had reinvented herself as an agent for the Independent Order of St. Luke, a fraternal organization that sold life and burial insurance. And I'll take credit for discovering Georgia Queen, who, again, nobody has written about. She's been completely forgotten about. I found her in the records of this Richmond-based Independent Order of St. Luke. Queen was recruited by Maggie Lena Walker, who was the director of the Order of St. Luke in Richmond. Walker is a very well-known figure in American business. So, and I won't be talking about her that much because she's a Richmond person, not a Newarker, but she has a part to play in this story. This is a recent, very good book about Walker. And you see her depicted there in the center of both of these images. Walker was the first Black woman in the United States to found a bank in 1902. And in the early 20th century, she was the only woman bank president in the United States. Walker had become the director of the Independent Order of St. Luke in the 1890s at a time when the Virginia-centered fraternal order was in decline. And to the surprise of the men who had presided over its decline, Walker revitalized the society and greatly increased its insurance business. She also expanded the society and its insurance sales northward into the growing Black communities in northern cities. And Walker must have met Queen during one of her recruiting trips in Newark. And most of Walker's paid agents and company officers were women, as you can see from this photograph. So, I mean, burial insurance was something that was very important to a lot of poor people, Black and white, in the United States. And for a lot of them, that was the one kind of insurance you'd want to have, because nothing was seen as like more horrifying than if a member of your family were to die, one of your children were to die, and they would have to be buried in a pauper's grave, an unmarked grave. And so, burial insurance, often sold through fraternal societies, was quite common in the late 19th century and in the early 20th century. For most white people, this had disappeared by the 20th century because of the rise of professionalized insurance by companies like Prudential. But because those companies didn't serve the Black community very well, some of this fraternal-based insurance lasted longer in the African-American community. And so when Maggie Walker took over this Independent Order of St. Luke, the men who had been running the society, as they say, had pretty much mismanaged it. And they were mostly making money by selling regalia for the order. So like hats with feathers on it and things for the members of the order. And they had let the insurance business kind of run itself out. And Maggie Walker, when she took over, it's like, we're not making hats. This insurance is the thing to do. And she really built it up. And she built it up into a huge business, so big that she had to create her own bank to manage the funds. And then, of course, she also realized just being based in Virginia wasn't enough, that Black people are moving up north. Let's move this business with them, right? So, hence recruiting people like Georgia Queen in Newark to sell insurance for her. So Queen proved to be the most successful agent of the Independent Order of St. Luke in America. She organized more than 50 councils across New Jersey and in parts of New York and Connecticut, including these 11 councils in Newark alone. So as I say, it's kind of combination of fraternal organization, insurance business. So these are like fraternal councils that are established among Black people in Newark, but they're selling insurance, right? Queen's achievement is especially impressive given her background. She was born in Virginia in 1860, possibly enslaved. She and her husband moved to Newark in the 1880s, where she worked as a domestic and he worked as a hostler. Mr. Queen's death in 1892 plunged Queen and her young daughter into financial insecurity. As we saw, her small house was bursting with 11 boarders in 1900. By 1910, Queen was financially secure as an insurance agent, and she only had one boarder in her house, a Black woman who was probably working as Queen's domestic at that time. Not surprisingly, Blanche Harris also worked as an agent for the Independent Order of St. Luke, right? What wasn't she doing? She established some councils in Newark, often in conjunction with the Georgia Queen, who I think was kind of a mentor for Harris in the insurance business. All right, by way of conclusion, I'd like to have us think about the issue of representation. So the Newark women that I briefly profiled this evening not only had to struggle against racist and sexist barriers, which impeded their economic advancement, they had to live in a society where their impressive achievements were downplayed, dismissed, and underreported. For some white Americans, it was impossible to imagine Black women in any role other than servant. This poster from 1918 is a case in point. It is one of the very few images from World War I that depicted Black Americans' contributions to the war. There are hundreds of different war posters that the American government published during World War I to encourage people to support the war effort. And out of these hundreds, maybe one or two featured Black people. They're virtually invisible as far as the American war effort, officially invisible as far as the American war effort went. So this poster was doubtless intended to convey the point that Black people were patriotic citizens, just like white Americans. Not everyone saw it this way. A white postmistress from Florida sent this poster to the Postmaster General as possibly seditious material, which the 1917 Espionage Act had banned from being sent through the mail. This white woman could not see the poster's patriotic message since she was enraged by its representation of Black people in comfortable middle-class surroundings. To depict Blacks other than as poor and servile seemed like treason or communist propaganda. A century ago, American popular culture, newspapers, magazines, advertisements, movies, radio, was saturated with demeaning images of Black women as servants, like Aunt Jemima. Classic example, which I believe only last year got dropped from the pancake boxes. Contrary images of upwardly mobile and economically independent Black women were nowhere to be seen in the mainstream media. This is an image of some Black women working for a Black-owned insurance company from the early 20th century. And it remains difficult to find such images today and to recover the history of these trailblazing Black women from Newark. Thank you. And I guess I meant, you know, since I will end with these references, my talks focused on Black women in Newark, you know, the period 1900 to 1925, and these women were, of course, were trailblazers, and they lit the path for many Black women entrepreneurs in Newark in the years since. And these are two sources that I think have a wealth of information about Black female entrepreneurship later in the 20th century or into the 21st century. And I believe the Scorsone article was based on a master's thesis she wrote at Rutgers Newark. Okay, so I think we have a little bit of time for questions. If anyone in the audience has questions, or Tim, I guess if there's any questions, people at home.
First, George, thank you. What was the Bureau of Negro Investigation in Newark?
Yeah, I wish I knew more about that, but you know, clearly this was this publication that was put out in 1920, and just never after that. So I guess it was kind of an attempt at an information service that just didn't prove to be profitable in the long term. I wish I knew more about the people behind it. So, yeah. Oh, sure, yeah.
So as background, what % of the Newark population was the Black population during the period that you're talking about?
Yeah, so it depends on what, so around 1900, about 5% of the population of Newark was Black. So it was a small population. It was an old population. It was a population that went back to colonial period, but that greatly expands during the Great Migration. So by the end of World War I, we're talking about 10% or more. So there's this big, big increase. And of course, it increases more in the 20s and 30s too. So.
George, let me pass along a comment from
Sure.
Rebecca Doggett. You'll want to talk to her because she says, as a child, I would take my grandmother's dues to St. Luke.
Oh.
They set up a shop once a month at the Black Y in Orange.
Oh, wow. I do want to find out.
Yeah,
I do want to talk to you about that because it's really hard to find information about these local councils, and the headquarters in Richmond, Virginia, which I haven't been able to go to for 2 years for obvious reasons. They sent me some information about these Newark councils, but yeah, I would love to talk to people who had family members who maybe were, still involved in St. Luke. Yeah, that'd be fantastic. Yeah.
And George, you might even just say how important any of these family records or archives would be. That if
Oh yeah, sure.
Becky, Carol Jenkins is here. These families that go back.
Yeah, I mean, look at anyone who has any information about family members who ran businesses or insurance records, family members. It'd be great. You can make copies of those records and donate them to the public library. You don't if they're important family mementos to you, you don't have to give them up. But yeah, just having copies in the New Jersey Historical Society, the New Jersey Room of the Newark Public Library, there's wonderful resources and photographs of family members from earlier in the 20th century. The library would love to have copies of those.
It would indeed. And Bill May's comment here is Beth Sack Cohen is a gift. 5 exclamation marks.
Yeah, she's been greatly helpful to me, that's for sure.
Camila Samar Majid comments or asked the question that on the slide where Anna E. Whittington at 253 Bank Street was shown, you mentioned that's now part of the site of Essex County College. Are there any historical markers bearing her name or any other visible historical markings
I don't
about her
think
imprint?
so. I don't think so. I could be wrong about this, but I'm pretty sure not. And because most of these women have been completely forgotten. And there's been a lot of talk recently about Black Wall Streets. That's a term that people talk about, 100 years ago, very prosperous Black business districts like the Greenwood section in Tulsa that unfortunately was destroyed by white racist mobs in 1921. But, other cities, especially southern cities that had large Black populations, had neighborhoods that were called Black Wall Streets, like important business districts. I think Newark had a Black Wall Street 100 years ago, and I think it was Upper Bank Street. I think that I found there's a huge concentration of Black-owned businesses there 100 years ago. 3 funeral parlors that were based there, Black insurance companies that were based there. There were barbershops and hairdressing salons that were based there, Black restaurants that were based there. It was right in Bethany Baptist Church was right in the middle of the block. And I think that led to the growth of a lot of these businesses near Bethany. So unfortunately, as I say, that neighborhood there's no remnants of it. So, but it would be nice to put some kind of marker to, to acknowledge that this was once part of a thriving, business community.
And Camila asks, what's the next step with all this history? Both, I guess, for your research, and she would love to have it integrated into the schools as a standard part of history.
Oh yeah, that'd be great, right? Well, I'm retiring at the end of this year, so I'll have more time to do this kind of thing. The book I need to finish that I've been working on for a long time is Newark, as a history of Newark during World War I. I did an exhibit on that several years ago, but I want to turn that into a book. And of course, the Black community in Newark during World War I is a big part of it because, of course, it's during the war that the Black community expanded tremendously in Newark, and there are all kinds of stresses placed on it and things like that. So part of this will go into that. Part of this work will go into that book. But yeah, there's a lot of room for other people to do work too. So.
First a comment about Tulsa. They had oil.
Yes, they did.
So maybe it wasn't the same thing. But my question was, could you tell us more about the concept of this council? Does that mean like because there's dozens of them in Newark, so does that like it was a club in this church or a club in that place? Or
Yeah, so let me see if I can. Is it turned off? Okay, so yeah, so it is a hard concept for us, so yes, they're fraternal organizations, but they're also insurance clubs. And so that's part of the beauty of how it worked. So if you didn't make your payments, right, you weren't just like stiffing a business. It was like your fraternal brothers and sisters were being, so there was a lot of like community, pressure that everyone had to keep it up. Because this is a community thing, and so if somebody died, the members of your fraternal order would come to your funeral, all dressed up in their fancy regalia. So I mean, it was there was this way in which this fraternal organization had social functions, right? They met and they did all kinds of things besides have this insurance business, but that was part of it. So I'd like to know a lot more about how many people were members of each council. I don't know that. Where, some of them, you see Bethany, you see St. James. I'm guessing those are based in those two churches, St. James, AME and Bethany Baptist. That's what I assume. But yeah, so, I would like to know a lot more about who were the members. And as far as I know, those records have not survived. The national headquarters in Richmond don't have those, and whoever kept these records, once these societies disbanded, I'm guessing they got thrown away. But hey, maybe someone's got a cache of this in their, somebody's grandmother kept these and they have them in your basement. I'd love to know more about this. But now that things are opening up more, I'm going to go down to Richmond and dig around in the national headquarters and find correspondence with the Newark chapters and try to find out more about how all of this worked. But yeah, there's a bigger story to be told here. But. Any other industries? Probably, but yeah.
A comment, the way I came across Anna Whittington was the New York Age. So sadly, I guess there were several newspapers, it sounds like African-American newspapers in Newark in the early 20th century, but none were saved. But the New York Age does cover, they have a whole Newark column. So that's possibly one resource for researching some of these women.
Oh yeah, thanks for bringing that out, because I didn't really talk about newspapers, and newspapers are really great, especially once you have names. But even now, because so many newspapers are being digitalized, you can do searches like Newark Businesswoman, in a Black newspaper or Black women business, and find all kinds of amazing stuff that 10 years ago even you couldn't do. So yeah, no, thanks for pointing that out, Beth. And the Newark did at various times have some African-American newspapers, unfortunately, that from this period that haven't survived. But in places like New York City or Pittsburgh or Philadelphia that had Black newspapers that have survived, they often would report on cities like Newark. And so there would be stories in those newspapers featuring, important events in Newark. So.
I'm affiliated with Bethany Baptist as well as St. James. Have you ever done this kind of historical journey? Yeah, back, because we do so much embodiment of jazz vespers and dancing and music. But if they ever decided to do like a historical crawl and had the kids dress up like some of these women, and then they just knew just 2 or 3 sentences of, something about them, that would be amazing. And the only reason why I thought about it, because Georgia King Village is not that far from Bethany Baptist. It's really close in that little quarter. And they're beautiful children there, but they don't know the history of why their building is even called Georgia King.
That's a great idea. And, and also because Bethany has just had its 100th anniversary, as I sort of consider this question of, did Newark have a Black Wall Street? And if it was on Upper Bank Street, to what extent was Bethany the genesis of that, right? So you've got this church, which is the center of the community, and that's the reason those funeral parlors were there, right? The church, right? And then but then it's like, oh, then we're gonna have dress shops and hat shops of the women who go to church to look nice. And we'll have barber shops and beauty shops for the people who go to the church. And then we've got these insurance companies that set up next to the church because they're selling burial insurance to the people. So, you know, the church itself becomes the kind of nucleus for which these businesses grow. And I probably not, this is probably not like an original thought on my part. There's probably other research in other cities that kind of show this, how this happens. But yeah, I think there's a lot of room, you know, to look at the other Black churches in Newark, the other old ones, and look at the businesses around them and see if you can see some similar kinds of patterns. But, you know, so I mean, I'm saying there's a lot of room for future research.
Katie Singer is reminding us about the Kruger-Scott
Yes.
Oral histories. She's
Right.
doing a book about that for Rutgers, I know.
Yeah, and I did not mention Scott because she's from a later period, but yeah, she's, you know, clearly another example of a beauty business in Newark being a very important part of the local economy.
I think what Katie is actually getting at is the oral histories that
okay.
were done through the Kruger-Scott mansion that where people are remembering former times. Have you been able to use those?
I have, to be honest,
You
I
have
haven't.
transcripts?
To be honest, I haven't looked at them. I do need to look at them. So yeah.
The transcripts are actually on digital.npl.org, as well as the William Ashby document is on there. So that's really great.
So I can go home tonight and start reading them.
Yeah, you can go.
Great.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
that's great.
I found some women in there. I was looking for Newark women, but from a later period, not this
Right.
early. But still, I haven't looked through all of them, so
Yeah.
there may be some stuff in there.
Okay, thanks.
This is why we also want to get people back in here. There's a wonderful exchange online here. Let
Yeah,
me
get your butts
capture a
in
little bit
person.
more.
Get your butts
Tere-
back here in person.
Teresa Nelson is saying that the councils are a little bit like the pleasure societies in New Orleans. Let's see here. Marcia Dunn is saying that my second great grandmother was a well-known caterer in Somerville.
Hmm.
My second great grandfather was a driver for Judge James Bergen. And she likes sharing her family history
Yeah.
in
There are catering
in
was
New
a
Jersey.
catering was a big business for Black people in Newark, and so was all kinds of transportation stuff like moving and storage, and a lot of Black chauffeurs. Those are really common businesses, and some of those businesses were ones that primarily served the white community, or served the white community just as much as the Black community. So I mean, most of the Black women I was looking at who were running dress shops and hairdressing salons and things like that were mostly serving people within the Black community. But you know, Black men in Newark who had delivery services and ICE delivery services and stuff like that, they were, you know, servicing the whole city. So
Yeah. Well, George, there's a lot of encouragement for you to continue this. Tony L says, I don't know the last name, but very inspiring presentation. One thing to consider is that many of these women didn't sprout out of nowhere.
Yeah.
Many had experience in the South and were part of the thriving set of Black Wall Streets down there that they hope to revive or recreate in Newark. For many, this entrepreneurial spirit was not new to them. They were forced to flee to the North after Reconstruction ended and the continuation of white terror began again down there. And she also thanks you for the shout out to Barbara Kukla, who has chronicled so much of this for other periods.
Yeah. No, that's a good point, and that's something I do need to dig into more. I would like to, because the majority of these women I looked at were born in the South. So the majority of these women are from like Virginia or North Carolina. So it would be good if I could find out more about their backgrounds, about their parents and where they were, if I can find out where they were from in the South, and maybe, to find out, like, did they come from entrepreneurial families? I mean, the one example I gave was Blanche Harris, who had, all these business ventures, whose mom had this restaurant in Newark. And so clearly she came from a family where her mother and her father were very enterprising as well, because the mother ran this restaurant and the father ran a hotel that was attached to the restaurant. So she obviously grew up in this family that was very entrepreneurial. So, yeah. No, I think that's an excellent point. Were you about played out here?
I think that's good, although I really like Aisha's suggestion here. George, you have to talk to Linda Caldwell Epps about doing this at Bethany with the right crowd. And there would be more like Becky Doggett who will remember
Yeah,
mothers
yeah.
and grandmothers.
No,
who
no,
are
I
engaged
do.
in all
Yeah.
this,
Look,
yeah.
anyone who knows anything about, yeah,
Yeah.
right. That'd
So-
be great.
I don't think we'll get there are wonderful comments in the chat that they won't hear the applause, but perhaps here we can thank George for this
Oh,
presentation.
yes. Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it.
April 5th is our next one.
April 5th, right. And we'll be meeting, where will we be meeting in person?
Centennial Hall.
Okay, so April 5th, we'll be here in person in the library. We'll probably be doing it by Zoom also, but hey, come in person. We're all vaccinated?
Thanks for staying.
Thank
It's
you.
interesting, isn't it? You know,
Absolutely.
it's just,
Yes.
oh,
Yes.
I know they really
yes,
do.
Yes, yes, they do.
Yeah.
Good stuff.